Welcome back to The Heat. Joining us now as we continue our discussion on the Malaysia Airlines plane crash in Ukraine is Alexander Nekrassov. He is a former advisor to the Kremlin. Welcome back to the show, sir. All week we've heard the Western version of what potentially happened to flight MH17. What do you think?
Well, the Russian Defense Ministry held a briefing a few days ago from its situation room, and they have shown satellite images and radar images of several Buk batteries deployed outside Donetsk by the Ukrainian army a day before the Malaysian jet was passing by, Malaysian airline was passing by. And the indications are that a missile might have been fired from one of these positions. Now, the version of events coming from Moscow is that the separatists, as they are called in the West, but federalists, as they are called in Moscow, in Russia, they do not have the capability to bring down an aircraft, a plane, flying at such high altitudes. And the separatists themselves were saying for many times before that if they had such opportunity, such ability, they would have brought down planes which are bombing Donetsk and other areas occupied by the fighters. So the notion is that there's also a suggestion coming, which I didn't hear in the West, that there are some units on the ground which are saying that they are federalists or separatists or anti-government forces that have their own agendas, that do not go under the control and command of the fighters, of the anti-government fighters, that basically do whatever they want. Now, there is also an assumption that one of these units of aircraft systems and used it against that plane. But again, the problem is that you have to have highly qualified military personnel to do that. Well, at the moment, it's very difficult
to interrupt,
to basically have a...
Our previous guest, Ukrainian guest, said that these were Putin's missiles that brought down MH17 and that the finger was squarely pointed at Moscow supplying the rebels.
Well, unfortunately, in the past day or two, there have been evidence to the fact that no, these missiles did not come from Russia. And I think that even some of the American experts were saying that no, there is no proof that Russia was involved in this. And I think that we've seen some signs that the position of some of the European countries has softened on that in this respect. They do still continue to say that the rebels on the ground might have been responsible and probably are, but there is no longer a direct accusation that Russia was directly involved in this. I have not heard any comments like that in the past couple of days.
Well, Russian President Vladimir Putin said actually that the Kiev government created the climate for this tragedy, seeming to suggest that even if the rebels were somehow behind this, that it's actually Kiev's fault because of the onslaught in the east. Do you agree with that?
Well, in a sense, I do agree with President Putin, because what he's saying is this, that the Ukrainian government has announced a ceasefire. The Russian government supported this idea and encouraged the Ukrainian government to start a conversation with representatives of the East and encouraged it to extend this ceasefire for longer in order to have that dialogue. Unfortunately, the government in Kiev decided to break the ceasefire, to start attacking the positions of these fighters. And what was even more amazing is that when the inspectors started to arrive to Donetsk in order to investigate the crash scene, the Ukrainian army started an attack and bombardment of Donetsk as well. And even some of the Western experts were puzzled by this, saying, why would they do this when the whole point was to secure the area, to provide, a peaceful conditions for these inspectors to study the wreckage. So, we are witnessing some very strange developments all the time on the ground. We're also hearing all sorts of wild accusations flying from both sides. I have to accept this. And this is why it's very difficult to understand what's very strange with the Russians, is that President Obama delivered that press conference a day after the plane went down and basically accused Russia without having any evidence. He actually said, this was not a time for propaganda, he said, and then lurched into this propaganda, claiming that Russia bears all the responsibility for this crash. And this was followed by a hysterical, basically, campaign by the Western media in Europe as well. And this is what is strange for us, is that if you don't have evidence, how can you blame anybody until you have that evidence? And up to now, the Pentagon and the intelligence services of the Western countries generally have not produced any evidence publicly. This was all mostly hearsay, rumors, and even, social media was quoted, which I find, a bit embarrassing, to be honest. So in this respect, I think it's a confusing situation still.
So the international outrage that's been created by this tragedy has brought a spotlight once again on what's happening in Ukraine, the country splitting itself apart. Do you think that this is an opportunity? You were an advisor in the Kremlin. What would you be advising Vladimir Putin to do now? And could he work with US President Barack Obama on settling the Ukrainian crisis?
Well, I think, first of all, you are right that this particular tragedy did attract the attention of the world to this crisis in Ukraine. Because let's face it, before that, that was a sort of a civil war going on there without anybody paying much attention to it. Now it has received an international dimension, even though, of course, through a tragedy. Now, obviously, for a while, I don't see any chance at all of any negotiations starting between Russia, Ukraine, and the European Union and America, simply because the atmosphere is not allowing this. We have accusations being made practically every day. We have those statements by journalists, by politicians who are talking about the grief of of the families of the victims and so on. In this particular instance, it's very difficult to sit down and talk. What I do hope is that people like me, that was my role in the past, behind-the-scenes troubleshooters, that these people will get together without all these ideology, without all these throwing accusations at each other, would start to think what can be done. And the only thing that can be done, the only way to sort this out, is for Kiev, to the government in Kiev, to talk to the people in the East, to their leaders. They can't sort it out militarily. They're thinking that they can actually simply wipe out all these anti-government forces and then install their authority in the East. This will not happen. And I warned that, weeks ago in my interviews, that volunteers from Russia will continue to arrive, because this is not just a simple conflict in a couple of areas in Ukraine. This impacts on Russia as well.
President Putin has been heavily criticized, though, by many Western leaders for his handling in the crisis of the Ukraine over the last few months. What about at home? Is his popularity grown? And what about abroad? Does this whole crisis enhance or damage his reputation?
Well, I can tell you that in Russia, the majority of people support Putin, and I think his popularity rating is very high at the moment. As regards what is happening outside Russia, obviously there are people who are accusing him of being indirectly, or some even directly, responsible for the downing of this plane and for the overall crisis over there. What I personally think is going on here is that there is a serious problem between America and Europe. Europe is not that keen on introducing drastic sanctions that will hurt Europe as well, against Russia, I mean. America, you see, is not going to suffer from these sanctions because its trade with Russia is not that substantial. But Europe stands to lose quite a lot. And that is why I suspect that we will continue to see European leaders saying, a lot of things and criticizing Russia, but America wants them to go.
US President Barack Obama has criticized Vladimir Putin personally and also said the Russian economy will suffer in the long run. He's playing the long game. Is he right? Is this strategy going to hurt Russia?
Well, I think that any sanctions, would have an impact on Russia. And just as any sanctions introduced by Europe will have an impact both on Russia and on Europe as well. So what we're witnessing here, I think, is a standoff. My personal view is that President Obama is being given a bad advice, but he's also being given advice by people who are telling him that his own popularity is not very high, and the midterm elections are approaching, and he stands to lose, he risks to lose the Senate to the Republicans, which will make his 2 years in power, to be quite honest, very difficult. So he has to be seen as tough, but unfortunately, this sort of standoff doesn't really produce anything. Until they start to talk to each other, then we can see something happening. Until accusations fly and are not even substantiated ones, unfortunately, we will see a deterioration of the crisis on the ground in Ukraine.
Alexander Nekrassov from London, thanks so much for joining us.